Welcome to our fall series of River Landing Conversations. We meet weekly at this time and have a lively conversation with either a senior staff member or a resident at River Landing. And today you get 2 for 1 because we have 2 residents from River Landing, Kathy and Dick Coe. And along with Helen Shields, my co-conspirator here, I'm Jim Kalaki. We're delighted that you've been able to join us today from either 1390 or anywhere else in the world that you may be watching. I know there'll be people watching this in Australia and Ireland, so we're River Landing's going international. Anyhow, Dick and Kathy, thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you. It's always lovely to see you, but it's particularly nice to see you in this setting. And Helen is going to be our lead-off questioner.
We know that you go by Dick and Kathy here. Was that your given name? And do you know how your family came to name you what they did? And how did you like the name as you grew up?
Well, my name obviously is Richard. This is the formal one, and I always use Dick, except my mother used to call me Richard when she was making a point. Actually, I've got a bit of a story on a name because one of my father's brothers and his wife were expecting the same time that my mother and father were. And they hadn't talked a great deal. And my cousin was born 2 weeks before I was. And guess what they named him? They named him Bob. That was going to be my name. So my parents in the last 2 weeks had to come up with a name, and they came up with Richard. Now, where that came from, I don't know, but and I'm very happy with it. I'm much happier being a Dick than a Bob. So
Well, I'm Kathy. I write Kathleen and say Kathy, usually. And I have always liked the name Kathleen very much. My only sister is 10 years older than I, and so when she married and started having children, she named her first daughter Kathleen.
Oh.
And in order to keep us apart, she was always Kathleen and I was always Kathy from then on. And then when our second daughter married and started a family, she named her oldest daughter Eleanor Kathleen after her 2 grandmothers. And so I'm privileged to share that name with 2 very special people. So
Wonderful.
Where were you born and where did you grow up? And did you grow up somewhere different than where you were born?
I did actually, yes. I was born in the great metropolis of Martins Ferry, Ohio, which is a small mill town on the Ohio River in eastern Ohio. And all of my family lived there, and my mother and father both had family there. We were very close, but when I was about 5 years old, just after World War I, my father started World War II. My father started a business in Pittsburgh, a wholesale business, and so we moved there. I went to kindergarten in Martins Ferry, and from then on in Pittsburgh. So, actually a suburb of Pittsburgh, Wilkinsburg, but I consider Pittsburgh where I grew up.
what she didn't tell you was that Martins Ferry is either just slightly upriver or downriver from the major metropolitan area of Dilly's Bottom. We're right in there.
I lived with that all my life.
You all didn't know you were going to get a geography lesson from Ohio today, did you?
My family was living in Utica. My dad was a Presbyterian minister in Utica, New York. But my mother's mother lived in Rochester. So I was actually born in Rochester at a hospital there and lived in Utica for about 6 years. Then we moved to a town called Palmyra, New York, which is sort of between Syracuse and Rochester. Noted for 2 things. It's got the 4 mainline churches on street corners, each one across the other, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Episcopalians. And that was where Joseph Smith found the tablets for the Mormon religion.
How
And so
interesting.
those are the two notable things about this little town that I was born and brought up in. And I stayed there till I graduated high school.
And the other notable thing is that you're from
Well,
that part of the
yes,
world
yes.
too.
That's written in big letters. Right?
Some of us have moved around quite a bit, as I know you have. Since there's two of you, let's do this. Kathy, why don't you go and tell us before you met Dick, and then we'll have him do that, and then you can sort of tell us together after you were married where you've lived and so forth.
Where we were living? Or,
Where have you moved
Before
you were married?
well, yes, Martins Ferry and Pittsburgh. And then we met in college in Ohio at the College of Worcester. It's a very, very fine Presbyterian college. And so that was pretty much the traveling that I did.
Okay,
My family loved to vacation, and we drove a lot of places.
okay, so then it was mostly the places you've been after you were married.
Yes.
Okay, well then go ahead with that, because you went from New York to Worcester.
I went from New York to Worcester.
Okay,
And then Kathy, you went?
Well, we've lived in Syracuse, New York, Nairobi, Kenya. We lived in Richmond, Indiana. We've lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, briefly. And let's see, Greensboro for 40 years more.
Plus years.
And we also had a mountain home in the Blue Ridge in Southern Virginia, and in addition to Greensboro. So it's a place we really cherished.
well, now everybody's going to know why Nairobi and Edinburgh.
Okay.
What did you do there, or why did you go there?
Well, Dick will tell you about Nairobi.
I was getting my PhD in political science from the University of Syracuse, and I was in there what was called the East African Studies program. And so I got a Ford grant to do research in Kenya. And that's how we, got over there for a year. And we thoroughly enjoyed that. Very nice experience, and we traveled a lot within Kenya and got down to Tanzania and other places as we wandered around. But that was basically it. It was a research assignment.
Wonderful way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we started that year, we had a 14-month-old.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
it was an interesting way for her to start life.
We stopped in Israel on the way to Kenya for some early research, and I always remember following Kathy. She was getting on the plane, holding our daughter and having a pot of boiled water, as we ventured into the unknown. This was while we were in Israel, but you never know.
That was before they had nappies or.
and how about Edinburgh?
Edinburgh, well, Dick was teaching at Earlham College in Indiana, and we took a group of 24 students to Edinburgh for the fall semester.
Wonderful.
In 1970, I guess it was, and had a great time.
Trying to keep track of 24 was it? College students is an interesting proposition. The way we really dealt with it was that they got support money periodically, for food and like that. So I doled it out at 1 week at a time. So every week they had to show up at a certain place to get their next week's money, and that's how we kept track of them all. And they all showed up, believe it or not.
Interesting. Rise, a good furrow course here would be getting folks like you who've had taken students abroad, just to talk about those experiences. Like, how did you keep all these people together and get them on the bus at the right time?
And these days, they would be much more independent than they were then.
Oh, my goodness,
I
yeah.
should say, yes. Well, you've given us a nice lead into the next thing we were curious about, and that is your, as you know, River Landing is full of people with interesting backgrounds and hobbies and so on, and present company included. And would you tell our viewers a little bit about your education, your interests, your hobbies, and how they've, as I say, you've touched on it briefly, but maybe a wee bit more about what that looks like in a,
Well, I majored in political science, history, and economics at the College of Worcester, and that was the area I was really interested in. And then looked on to graduate school, and I'm one of 3 generations of family that went to Syracuse for something or other. Wow. And I applied to Syracuse, the Maxwell School, and also to Cornell. And quite frankly, Syracuse gave a better if you will, support than Cornell. And interesting, if I'd gone to Cornell, I would have been in public administration. I went to Syracuse to get a PhD. Later on in life, I've ended up in administration most of my life, so maybe that was where I was due to end up anyway. So after got the degree, I taught at Earlham for a while, and then came down to Guilford, sort of following a Quaker circuit. You know, there are a few Quaker schools, and we tend to shuffle around, I guess is the word. And I got into finance. I was in the Dean of Students office to start with. I was interested in administration and helped start the overseas program that Guilford College has now for, the semester students. But then I got interested in finance and was, business manager for 18 years, I think there's something like that. And then the opportunity at Friends Homes became available, and I became the chief operating officer of Friends Homes and in charge of Friends Homes West before I retired. So that in brief is my working career. Hobbies I can get into, but maybe Kathy wants to talk about her working career first.
Okay. Well, I guess early in life, I've always been interested in music and writing. I came from a very musical family. And when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, I was not only in the marching band playing saxophone, but mainly I was playing violin in 2 different symphony orchestras in addition to the school orchestra. And so music was a big part of my growing up life. When I went to college, I had had so much music that I decided I was going to do something different, and ended up taking a lot of science and majoring in religion. And it was not until a couple of years after I finished college that I really wished I had majored in music. So I went back and worked my way into graduate school and got a master's in music history and literature, but then taught music for a number of years. And after a certain amount of time, I realized I really would like to have a full-time job with benefits. And fate led me to the News and Record in Greensboro, where I got in the back door. Worked for a while in the copy desk, and then became news editor. And then after that, moved over to the editorial department, where I was an editorial writer and deputy editorial page editor, which was a job that I just loved. We interviewed, I was telling Helen, we interviewed all the local and state candidates for just about every office, and very often national candidates when they came through, and it was just a marvelous experience. And every day we would meet in the morning and decide what we needed to write about that day, and then divide up among the 4 of us particular subjects, and then spend the rest of the time exploring and researching. And we had daily deadlines, which was good. It wasn't until after we had grandchildren that I decided to go to seminary. And so I went over to Duke every day on Route 40 for 4 years. I'm so glad I don't have to do that now every day. And just was really blessed to be able to do that, and then spent several years as pastor of a small friends meeting. So
I was just thinking, Kathy, when you were talking about being a writer at the paper, that people in roles like that, at least at that time, I'm not sure, first of all, there are many people in roles like that these days, but you must be, you would have had such a knowledge of the community and the area.
Well, we came to, certainly,
Yeah.
in having all of those contacts. And so, but that's a tremendous responsibility to be writing opinion And I was so fortunate to be at the News and Record in an era when journalists really had strong convictions, strong standards, and really tried to be unbiased. And the mentors that I had there were wonderful. So I was very lucky to be there when I was.
Neat. Well, when you were young, growing up, like in high school or that age, did you have something that you absolutely thought you wanted to be? And did that happen, or did that, like, I think in my case, all little boys, I think, want to be firemen at some stage, but then you get beyond that stage sometimes, and then there's something that you want to be. Did that happen for either of you?
I was reflecting on that, and I don't think so. I sort of have a view of sort of the evolution of, where we are is really an evolving situation. Mm-hmm. And I've always valued that liberal arts education I got at Worcester, which gave me, I think, the ability to adapt as time, goes on. And I went from being a teacher to a dean of students to, a finance person, and then administrative retirement community, I think all building on, that foundation of education. Mm-hmm. But when I was young, I'm not sure I spent a lot of time, saying, well, I'm going to be down the line. Yeah. It just evolved as opportunities came up.
Yeah, I've always admired people who knew from an early age what they wanted to be. That's a miracle to me. One of our daughters was, she's an artist, and when she was 1 year old, she was already trying to draw. And it's just, that was her fate, and that was the way she was put together. And that's just always amazed me.
Her notebook in sort of grade school and high school, we'd look at it periodically. There were a few notes, but a lot of little characters that, that she would draw. Yeah. That was how she took notes, and she just drew. I'm not sure she cared what the teacher was saying, but she liked to draw.
Well, just a short thing on interest. Tell the viewers about your railroad experience.
Well, I belong to 2 railroad historical societies, and I know that comes from my father, who was also a railroad fan, and over the years, there's a particular railroad in upstate New York that's long gone, but Dad and I, and bless Kathy's heart, Kathy, have probably followed every inch of that roadbed that we possibly could. She didn't know what she was getting into when she got married. But I find it fascinating. I love history, and railroads had such an important impact, on the development of communities. And so I have had this abiding interest in railroad history. Also love sports. I was a stamp collector, but since the government has done so much with stamps, I've given that one up. But, and I'm an avid reader. Both of us devour books, I think, so fair enough.
So.
Yours?
Oh, your railroads? Okay, for me, I guess it's always been music, yeah. And, I love to play the piano, and I welcome opportunities to play the piano. I'm kind of a utility infielder when it comes to playing the piano, whatever needs to be done, wherever. But I love to play, I play Chopin nocturnes, I play Mozart, I play a lot of ragtime, and the thing that I probably play most is ballads from the 30s and 40s, those old songs that had wonderful lyrics that you could sing, and I find that they bring back memories to lots of folks around here too. So, and I like to, I write poetry, belong to a couple of poetry groups, and so.
One thing, one positive thing of Zoom, okay? Is that there are a lot of positive things, I'm sure, but I belong to this railroad group up in upstate New York, and they do a lot of good publications about this railroad in New York, et cetera, but I've never attended a meeting until COVID came along, and they couldn't meet anymore. So now they meet through Zoom. And this group has 450 some odd members, and they used to get 30 or 40 members at a meeting. Now they get a couple hundred, because we can all tune in, and that's a very
great.
nice, and so we hear, the various programs that they put out. So there's a plus for maybe, I'm not sure I'm gonna give a plus to COVID, but, at least the way we're dealing with it has opened up some things.
There's always, when a door closes, another one opens somewhere. Well, one of the things we've written down here was, what might folks like to know about you that they don't already know? I realize as I'm saying that, that's a really awkward sort of question. I mean, it assumes that you've got a light into somebody's mind out there, but what,
I guess for me, maybe the poetry. About 5 years ago, I self-published a book of poems, but I've tried to keep up with poetry.
Yeah, and you belong to several poetry groups.
Yeah.
Maybe to no one's surprise of those who know me, I'm an avid sports fan. In fact, that we both have separate studies is great, so Kathy can write her poetry while I'm watching the sports. But I'm a diehard, bless my heart, Syracuse University fan, okay? Which has ups and downs. I may be the only person at River Landing that has a license plate with Syracuse on it. And even worse, I guess, is I'm a Detroit Tiger baseball fan since 1953, which means I've had few very good teams to root for, and a lot of bad ones, but I haven't given it up. So I guess it's that sports background.
Hopeless cases.
Yeah.
and I'm sure the Detroit Tigers greatly appreciate.
Yes, well, they're on the upswing now, so.
Yes, indeed. And if the details were taken care of, who are 3 people in all of time that you would like to sit and have a visit with or a meal with?
For me, number 1 is Wendell Berry, who is still alive. He is 87 years old. He's a writer in Kentucky, and I love all of his books. About a year ago, I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back. And I have this wonderful letter written in pencil on a yellow legal pad, and I treasure it. So I would love to sit down with him for longer. I owe him a letter. Another is Karen Blixen, the writer who wrote Out of Africa, from which the movie was taken. We have 2 connections with her. When I was in high school, we had a Danish exchange student who lived with our family, and she introduced me to Karen Blixen's writing. And then when we were in Nairobi, we lived 15 miles from the Ngong Hills, where Karen Blixen lived when she wrote Out of Africa. And we visited her home in Denmark as well. And then I think the last one is William Butler Yates, who is one of my favorite poets, so Irish poet.
Interesting table.
Right. Well, if you ever get to, well, you won't get to Yates. He's but
In another world.
In another world, yes. But Wendell Berry, I share your view about. He's, I think, one of America's great gifts to the world.
Oh, I think so too. Thank you.
Well, for me, I'm going to keep it relatively recently. Someone I'd really like to talk to is David McCullough, the historian. I've read most of his books, and I just like to, sit down and both learn about how he approaches the subject, but just, all the wonderful books that he's written, and, he's fairly widespread. And so he's one person I'd really like to talk to. The other 2 are a little bit maybe peculiar, and they have a thread, I think, in common. One is Harry Truman, and the other is a baseball player named Al Kaline, who is he passed away just recently, but he was one of the Tiger greats. And what I'd like, both of them have if you will, an aura about them. Harry Truman, one can argue plus or minus about what he's done, but that famous expression, the buck stops here, there aren't many politicians, certainly today, who are willing to say that and act upon it, you know. And I'd like to, you know, talk to him about that and his experiences, what, you know, how he made all those decisions and what kind of heat he took and how he managed to, you know, sort of stay in there. And Al Kaline, a very fine gentleman, near as one can tell, a great ball player. And this is the amazing part of Al Kaline. Way back when, there was only, I think, one ball player that ever earned over $100,000 a year in a contract, believe it or not. And Mr. Kaline had a year in which, for most ball players, was great. For him, it wasn't. The Tigers offered him a contract at $100 million.
100,000.
Excuse me, I'd say 100 million, I meant 100,000. Excuse me. I'm talking about today's dollars. $100,000, and he refused it. And he refused it because he said he didn't earn it the year before. How many athletes today would do that? I mean, that's a different era when you know, it meant something to earn something. You know, now we can talk $100 million because there, you know, somehow people get that. But just that kind of integrity, and you know, I'd like to talk to him.
Need.
Would you share with us an experience or two that you've had that were special at River Landing?
Well, one really does stand out in my mind, and that was several years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, at Christmas time. We were given the opportunity to make a contribution for a luminary, and we had luminaries all around the pond. And one night, all of them were lit, and there were names of the donors on each luminary, which meant that someone had to spend a lot of time writing. But it was just very inspiring and wonderful, and it drew the community together as we strolled around the pond, reading all these names. And I would love to see us do that again sometime.
Great idea. Dick?
Well, this, number one, this is a general statement, as I have been so pleasantly surprised at all the people we've met here, interacted with, you know, and got to know, and there's so many stories here that people have, you know, that's just been a fine overall experience. A specific one, in a little different vein, but when I was on the resident council, I got to work with Cindy Hawks in developing the transitions thing that she does every year. I had that in my background. And, you know, I know at friends' homes, I found all too often that people, you know, would come to a retirement community. They knew there was assisted living, healthcare, et cetera, but didn't know much about it or all the intricacies that people have to go through as they move. And, you know, Cindy developed that, and I was, you know, glad to work with her on that, which points up that how kind of open River Landing is to, you know, things that we can do, whether it's that or, you know, additional activities, what you're doing with Furl and all that, you know, there's a nice set of opportunities that folks have here.
Yeah.
And that we can develop as things hit us.
And it speaks, I think, wonderfully to River Landing and its administration, and they're also smart to take advantage of these resources that are around to enhance the community. Are there things that we haven't covered that you thought we might as we go through this conversation?
I thought your questions were very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the only thing I would add is that one of the things we really like here is the ability to do all the walking we do. You know, all this, you know, the golf course is great. We don't play golf, but we sure do enjoy the golf course for walking, and that's just a real nice extra positive for being here.
Yeah, when we go out every morning, or most mornings, we talk a lot while we walk. So by the time we get home, we've pretty much figured out how to fix the world.
We're glad someone.
Never does any good, we can't communicate it, but anyway.
And with the new pathways on the golf course, the world is even going to be in a better place.
The world is our oyster.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for coming and for being a part of this conversation series.
It's been delightful.
It's just been a joy. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to another river landing conversation at the same time next week. Good afternoon.